Good morning. So glad to have you here this morning. If you are a guest, we especially want to welcome you here. If you live in the local area or if you live far away and you're with us, we want to ask you to take one of those blue cards in front of you and just give us your name, your email, your phone number. You can drop it off in the collection tray that's out in the foyer. We would just love to follow up with you and make sure you receive some additional information from us. Welcome to part 4 in this 8-part series based in the book of Ruth. The series is called Backstory. All of these messages are archived on our website, and you can look at all 8 of them along with sermon manuscript, sermon slides. Along with this series is a journal. We have some physical copies here in the foyer. This is also available online through the website. This journal gives you some space to write some notes or draw some pictures in case you don't like the sermon, and to track your progress on 4 areas related to this series, summarized by the word Ruth. The word R, read. Read the book of Ruth each week during this series. It takes about 15 minutes. You uncover the way in which some of what you're reading is happening in your own life through some self-reflection. T, transcribe, that is, write down, handwrite 10 to 11 verses from Ruth each week. By the end of the series, you'll have written the entire book of Ruth. And then H, heed, or live into one of the several invitations that are given at the end of each one of these messages. A recent article in The Atlantic talked about the Sharing Depot, which is based in Toronto. The Sharing Depot. You might think of Home Depot, but the Sharing Depot. Here's how they summarized it. At the Sharing Depot, a storefront in Toronto, $50 a year. I mean, that's a burger and a Coke here in Stamford. Buys tens of thousands of dollars worth of tools, camping supplies, furniture, games, toys, sports equipment, and much else, at least on a short-term basis. The owners of the space call it a library of things, and anyone who pays the annual membership fee can borrow anything in the Sharing Depot. Can you imagine that? Imagine going to Target or to Best Buy or to Home Depot, and you have a long list of things, and you walk out without them because you don't have enough resources to buy all those things. But in this case, they tell you to come back in because for $50 a year, everything on your list is yours. And you take cart after cart after cart out. Because your own limited resources no longer factor into this, they have created a new sharing economy where you're able to finally get those resources that you've long needed. Now, the article, it's okay to say amen. The article went on to talk about the history of sharing within human cultures. And they noted this: hunter-gatherers, which is what humans were for most of the time, they've been humans, are thought to have shared nearly everything. According to Sam Bowles, a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, hunter-gatherers likely didn't have a conception of private property. Among mobile hunter-gatherers during the late Pleistocene, food was almost certainly widely shared as it was acquired. If you didn't share, you'd be violating a basic social norm. Now, we're so far away from anything like that, it's almost impossible for us to imagine what that must have been like. But at least there was a season in human history where one of the most fundamental elements, food, was treated more as public property and less as private property. There was a sharing economy when it came to food. And all of this got me to thinking about those times in my own life when I've had opportunities to share or have been forced to share, especially food. My mind went to the away trips that we would take when I played high school football. I played high school football for a single A school in rural New Mexico. It was the smallest size school in rural New Mexico, and that meant we only played other single A schools in the state of New Mexico. Most of those schools were tucked far away into the corners of the state or in the middle of vast nowheres in the state. And so it took hours to travel to these away games. So we would always have to take a bus, and we'd get on that bus at 8 o'clock in the morning. And by noon, when the sun was high and the windows on the bus were cracked because there was no air conditioning, and we teenagers were ravenous because breakfast was like yesterday ago, we all did the same thing. We'd all pull out our sack lunches, and we'd open them up, and we'd take the contents out. And the moment we did that, the battle for sharing began. Because every one of us now had to do battle with 6 other people. The 2 that were sitting in the bench seat in front of us, the 2 that were in the bench seat immediately behind us, the 1 that was in the bench seat right next to us, and the 1 that was just across the aisle in the bench seat across from us. Once you opened your lunch bag, 6 pairs of eyes were peering into your bag, and 6 pairs of hands were wanting you to share what you had. And then your eyes were looking at their bags, and your hands were reaching for what they had. And for the most part, this was an enforced type of sharing, especially if you were a junior or a sophomore, and the hands reaching for yours were hands belonging to seniors or juniors. And so inevitably, you end up sharing food that you never intended to share, that you only wanted for yourself. One of my friends found a way to beat the system. His name was Kevin. Kevin never had to share his lunch. And he did this by packing the same lunch on every away trip. And he did this by eating the first part of that sack lunch the same every away trip. Do you know what that first piece of lunch was? It was a yellow onion. Kevin would pull out a yellow onion from his lunch sack, and after removing the parts of the yellow onion that were inedible, he would chomp into it like an apple, like it was a golden delicious. And with every chomp and with every bite, until it was completely gone, the 6 pairs of eyes peering at his bag were tearing up. And the 6 pairs of hands ready to grab his lunch were backing up. Because after that reeking, stinking onion, no one wanted what else was in his bag. Kevin worked hard not to share his food. Okay, so for our picnic this afternoon, we have yellow onions. That's all we have. We have tables full of yellow onions, now that you're nice and hungry. Okay, so all of that prepares us for this wonderful scene in Ruth chapter 2. We'll be in chapter 2 for several weeks. We'll look at what it means for Boaz to be called a redeemer in this story. We'll be looking at the courage of Ruth and Naomi in requesting help from Boaz. But this morning, we want to look at Boaz's generosity in the gleaning of the grain from his fields. So let's get parts of chapter 2 back into our mind here. So again, chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." Then verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Verse 14. And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread, and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. So she gleaned in the field until evening. And then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also bought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And then verse 19. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Now, one of the things that's vital to understanding what's going on here is that Ruth and Naomi suffer from what we would call food insecurity. Ruth and Naomi, now back in Bethlehem in Judah, are widows. And as widows, they didn't have the social resources. They didn't have the legal resources that a married woman would have in Bethlehem in Judah. And Ruth in particular, as an outsider, as a foreigner, a word that she uses to describe herself in this chapter, would not have the same resources that an insider, that a person native to Bethlehem in Judah would have. Their very life is in danger because of their lack of access to food. And Boaz, who belongs to the same clan as Naomi's husband, who has died back in chapter 1, is a generous, compassionate farmer. It's harvest time. His workers are in the field gathering up the grain. And Boaz, in his generosity, decides to make available the resources of his fields to Ruth, and through Ruth to Naomi. And again, this word glean or gleanings is used in the text. And what it's referring to here is simply that in that time the workers would go through the field and they would gather up the grain, they would bundle things together, but inevitably and intentionally, they would not gather up everything. There were always parts of the field that remained. And rather than going back through and gathering all of that up for themselves, Boaz and people like him would leave those food resources for those who were struggling with food insecurity. People like Ruth, people like Naomi. In other words, Boaz treats his private property, these fields, as a kind of public property. He makes available the food resources in these fields to people who do not have adequate food resources. And again, this is all the more surprising for us who are reading this story, given that Ruth is an outsider. You would think that perhaps these gleanings would be made available primarily and only to those insiders in Bethlehem and Judah who are struggling with food insecurity. But now even Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the outsider, Ruth who lives in the margins, is invited to partake. It's almost as if Boaz has pulled out a chair at a table and invited this outsider to come and have a seat at his table to take care of her own food needs. Now, why does he do this? Why does he not only make available the gleanings of the field? Why does he make even more available? So much so that she has some 30 to 50 pounds of grain that she takes with her home to Naomi, enough to provide for her and Naomi for weeks, even for months. Why does he also provide her this meal, this food, and this water, so she has the energy to keep on harvesting during this long harvest day? Why does he provide counsel? Counseling her to stay in his fields where protection might be more guaranteed, counseling her to stay with the other women who are reaping, so there's fellowship and friendship and companionship and community. Why does he counsel his workers to leave her alone and not to harass her? All of this is rooted in his faith. Boaz is a man of faith. And what he is doing is living out the faith that's been given to him. And we see this reflected numerous times throughout the Old Testament. Here in Leviticus 19, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge. Neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare. Neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord, your God. Verse Leviticus chapter 23. And when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord, your God. And Deuteronomy 24. When you reap your harvest in your field, and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. Because of Boaz's faith, because of his own commitment to living life in light of God, he now makes available his resources so that those struggling with food scarcity might have what they need in order to survive. And notice how Naomi interprets all of this. Once Ruth returns to her with this huge harvest of grain and this story of Boaz's generosity and his counsel and his protection, in Ruth chapter 2, 19 and following, we hear, and Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he, Boaz, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. The word kindness is the Hebrew word chesed. And we've already seen in this series how the word chesed shows up in the book of Ruth and how important this word is in the Old Testament. It serves two purposes in the Old Testament. It's a word that summarizes who God is. If you ask the Old Testament who God is, the Old Testament says God is a God of Hesed. God is a God of loving kindness, which may run contrary to the ways that some of us have misunderstood the Old Testament. Well, I thought he was a God of judgment. I thought he was a God of wrath. But what Scripture tells us, he is a God of Hesed, loving kindness. And second, we've seen this is a word used to summarize the kind of life that God calls us to live. If we were to ask the Old Testament, how are we to live? The Old Testament replies by saying, live lives of chesed. Live lives of loving kindness. And Naomi looks at the generosity of Boaz, the way in which he's provided the food that they do not have. And she says, there is a sign of the chesed of God. She's able to see behind Boaz to the God who's inspired Boaz, and to see the provision of food as a sign of the loving kindness of God. Now, this is so important because in our own culture, we do not always allow our own faith to inspire us to do what Boaz did, especially when it comes to the fundamental element of food. I've mentioned this book before, Daniel Nayari, a true story called Everything Sad is Untrue. It tells the true story of his move from Iran to the United States. They were fleeing for their lives. They were refugees. They landed in Edmond, Oklahoma, and lived in poverty there. So much so that as Daniel went to public school, he relied on food assistance programs to provide that basic school lunch for him. But sometimes he and other kids like him would go to lunch and they'd find that their account was empty. There was no money in it. And so in the book, he describes what would happen. He said, they take you to the office where the ladies give you 3 saltine cracker sandwiches with peanut butter in the middle. They call your mother and say, his account is empty. You'll have to request the assistance program through the office. No, the district office. No, they only accept requests through our AP. It stands for Assistant Principal. Just send it to us and we'll take care of it. You're welcome. And they sigh again. The way they toss the bag of crackers at you makes you feel like the lowest thing in the world. It's against policy to make a kid go hungry, but you can tell you're not their guest. If you were a guest, you'd be treated with kindness and tea and all the best food they could offer. Being generous to guests is one of the most different things about these countries. In Iran, when a guest comes, you tell them they may be angels. They are welcome, and the whole house is filled with the joy of their presence. And the person always apologizing is the host, that they might have more to offer. But here, it seems guests are supposed to apologize all the time that they're taking anything. It's like they think the host is burdened. I don't understand it, but I know I never want to go to the house of any of these grown-ups who make you beg for so little. Now, granted, it's just his experience, but it is his experience. There are times when even in our own country, we don't respond in the way that Boaz responded when it comes to the basic provision of food. And this issue of food insecurity is really one of the major themes in the book of Ruth. The story begins that way, when a famine makes food scarce, and Naomi and her family have to go to the Moabites to gain food. And it's their hospitality that makes that food available. This is the issue that we see throughout chapter 2, when Ruth and Naomi, now living as widows, don't have adequate access to food. And it takes the compassion and generosity of Boaz to remedy that situation. We've noted in this series already that this story is in our Bible because it's the backstory to Jesus. Naomi and Ruth's son are the ancestors to Jesus. And so one of the things that it tells us is that the story of Jesus itself is rooted in the issue of food insecurity and the provision of food. And what a wonderful glimpse it gives us into the fullness of the ministry of Jesus as Jesus establishes this table where people are invited who are normally rejected, and they find a seat at his table, where Jesus in John 13 and following creates this table that we just sat at in communion. And he offers the food of his own body and his own blood, which is given for all who need it. None are turned away from that table. The book of Ruth and the actions of Boaz are little glimpses into what we see more fully in the ministry of Jesus. And so I think one of the things that the book of Ruth challenges us to do is to recognize our role in addressing contemporary forms of food insecurity and the way in which others get to experience the chesed, the loving kindness of God through the basic provision of food. A few weeks ago, I was at a gathering that was held at Ferrygate Farm. This is a neighborhood garden here in Stamford, just behind the Stamford Hospital. And there were representatives from all of these groups that are pictured here on this slide here: Pacific House, the Stamford Food Collaborative, New Covenant Center, the rest that are listed here, Food Rescue. All these groups had come together for the purpose of engaging in dialogue to see how they might better link arms to address food insecurity in our own city. Afterwards, I was emailing back and forth with a new friend who has been researching this issue in Stamford. And I asked him if he had some pretty hard numbers that could be trusted. And he said from all the studies that he's looked at and been a part of, these are the numbers that he thinks really stand firm. That there are 14,000 to 15,000 people right here in the city of Stamford that suffer from food insecurity. And what the book of Ruth is saying to us is that that's Naomi. That's Ruth. And what the book of Ruth is asking us is, who's going to be Boaz? Because the very survival of at least some of these people, depending on a few people like Boaz standing up and turning our resources into their resources. I think it's really fascinating as you think about the connection between this book and the story of Jesus, that without Boaz's compassionate devotion to addressing food insecurity, Naomi and Ruth, ancestors of Jesus, would have perished. And with them, so would the roots of the story of Jesus itself. In feeding Naomi and Ruth, Boaz was actually feeding the one who was coming after them, Jesus Christ. The story of Jesus only happens because Boaz's faith leads him to nourish these forerunners of Christ. And one of the things the book tells us is that faith isn't simply about saving sinful souls. Faith is also about feeding hungry bodies. And there's so many different ways in which that might take place in our own lives. From the table in our own kitchen and dining room to the ways in which we link arms with others in this area to make even more available. And so let me invite you to consider this for your own self as we bring this message to a close. Which of these invitations might you live into this week? One, choose an organization that helps with food insecurity in this area and become a volunteer for them. Two, consider some ways that you might take your private property and make it more public property. And three, begin with a simple step of inviting someone to share a meal with you. Let me invite you just to take a few quiet seconds and reflect on those three invitations this morning.